Welcome, everyone, to the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast, where we speak to interesting and knowledgeable people about how best to protect sentient beings from the harms of coming into existence. I am your host, John, an antinatalist advocate from the UK, and I'll be the main host of the podcast going forward. As you surely know by now, we have four cause areas in AA: human suffering, animal agriculture, wild animal suffering, and the topic of today's podcast, artificial sentience. We chose these as cause areas because we believe that antinatalists have a particularly promising role to play in addressing these particular issues. We have created introductory podcast episodes to explore the relevance of these issues for antinatalists and what we can do both individually and collectively to take action to try and improve the situation. I admit that I knew quite a bit more about the other three cause areas than the topic of artificial sentience, which is why for this episode we sought to bring on a fellow antinatalist who was knowledgeable on the subject to give us the rundown. We were therefore very grateful when Michael, aka Space Science Guy, agreed to come back on the podcast to explain what artificial sentience is and why it's an important issue. A quick disclaimer before we begin. Michael has recently changed his public branding to Space Science Guy from his previous name, Vegan Space Scientist, which is the name he appeared under in episode 3 of the podcast, Introducing Effective Altruism. He hadn't made the switch at the time of recording this episode, which is why you'll hear me refer to him as Vegan Space Scientist at points in this recording. I've made sure to include his updated branding in the links in the description, and yes, in case you were wondering, he's still a vegan. Anyway, without further ado, I bring you episode 12 of the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast with Michael, Space Science Guy. Enjoy.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 12 of the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast, and welcome to our guest, Vegan Space Scientist. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, John. Really good to be back.
Right. As I was going to say, you are the first external guest to be on twice. Lawrence doesn't count, obviously, because he doesn't count as a guest on this podcast. Yeah, thank you so much. And you're on our third episode to talk about effective altruism and antinatalism.
Yeah.
And today we're going to be drilling into one of our cause areas, which certainly for me at least is one which I know the least about, one I find a bit murkier. So yeah, we're really grateful to have you on to talk to us about digital sentience and why it might be something of concern for antinatalists. But before we get to that, and without covering too much old ground, because we do a much longer introduction in episode 3, why don't you tell us a bit about who you are, where you're from, what you're up to, that kind of thing?
Yeah, happy to. So my technical background is mostly in geoscience, and I did a PhD in space science. But then more recently, I've dedicated most of the last maybe 5 years of my life to trying to reduce suffering as effectively as possible. So most of that being through, I guess, the effective altruism lens. I was working at Sentience Institute for about 2 years. I recently left that role a couple of months ago. I think when you first pitched this idea to me for this podcast, I was still working at SI at the time. So I probably should say wouldn't be appropriate for me, obviously, to represent the views of SI in any way, but just because SI does a lot of work in this space, I will probably be referring to their work a fair bit. So just wanted to cover that. But in general, I guess, generally I'm mostly focused on, I guess, research around reducing suffering and a little bit in policy, done some work with the Animal Justice Party, a political party in Australia, working on animal rights. And I think that covers the important stuff.
Great. And as you mentioned, your time at the Sentience Institute, I definitely came across the Sentience Institute for their work on, or for their spotlighting the treatment of non-human animals. But then I definitely saw a shift over the past few years to talk about digital sentience or artificial sentience, and why. So from that kind of effective altruist reducing suffering kind of lens, this can be something of concern. So
Yeah.
to start us off, like, why don't you tell us a bit, like what, first of all, like, what is artificial sentience?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start by defining sentience, if that's all
Yes,
right.
but that
So,
might be a good.
yeah, sure. So, because I want to point out that some people define sentience differently. Some people use sentience and consciousness pretty interchangeably.
Yes.
I and Sentience Institute, and I think like most academics would define sentience and consciousness separately, where sentience is um, the ability to have negative and positive experiences. So basically, suffering or pain, and like pleasure and well-being. So we have that, humans. We think most non-human animals, if not all, maybe have that. We think some invertebrate animals have that. Um, so yeah, I guess sentience is, for some ethical frameworks, what gives something. If something is sentient, it has moral worth. Um, it's not every ethical framework will say that's the only thing that gives something moral worth, but that seems to be an important one for a lot of them. So with that out of the way, artificial sentience is any non-naturally occurring, maybe non-biological, but not necessarily, and I'm able to talk about that why in a sec, but basically any non-natural entity that has sentience, that has the ability to experience pleasure and pain, and has some moral worth by a utilitarian definition at least. So that could be the form of an artificial intelligence that has um, developed the capacity to experience pain and pleasure. But there could be other things, like there could be hybrid, biological, digital life forms that some people have proposed, that wouldn't be like, it might have some biological aspects, but wouldn't be natural. It would be a form of artificial sentience.
That definitely makes sense. Just a quick question about how you understand sentience, because as you mentioned, people have different understandings. I kind of view sentience as almost like a light that comes on for certain beings, like the ability to have like a subjective experience, the pleasure and pain, as you're saying. And then having had that light that turns on, then you can have differing degrees of pleasure and pain, the things that we already talked about. But I think that the reason I say it's a light that turns on is because I think that there are some beings, objects, or whatever you want to say, entities is probably the best word, that are sentient. And then there are others, like my socks, where the light just never turns on. Whereas for human beings, it does turn on, at least while we're alive, for a period of time. But others talk about kind of like a gradations of sentience, and it's often in reference to moral values. So they'll say, like, a human is more sentient than, say, a pig, but a pig appears to be more sentient than, say, an ant, something like that. But I find that one personally a bit confusing. I don't know about more of an ability to have a subjective experience. I find a bit odd. I'd say more of an ability to experience pleasure and pain. But yeah, that's why I tend to view it as just like almost like being pregnant. You either are or you aren't. If that makes sense. Like, how do you view it in terms of like scale of sentience?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The very short answer is there's still some debate about this, and I think probably we don't really know. People, I guess, make assumptions often when they say that, say, a pig has somewhat less sentience than a human. So, I mean, I think like we don't know, and that's sort of an assumption based on other factors that,
Yes,
like for example, intelligence. By most definitions of intelligence that we use, I guess we're more intelligent than a pig, but that doesn't necessarily mean, I think, that therefore they're less sentient.
yes.
Some people use something like a proxy of how many neurons does the entity have in their brain. Like an ant has, I forget, hundreds, maybe thousands, I don't know, of neurons. A lot less than humans do. So
Yes.
if neurons are what give us sentience, maybe it's reasonable to assume that ants would have a lot less of that than us.
Don't many whales and dolphins, like killer whales and blue whales, have a lot more neurons than us, though?
Well, yes. So I mean, that if you're going to say that, then maybe you want to say that dolphins and whales have a greater degree of sentience than us, and I'm very open to.
Yes.
I mean, I'm open to the idea that there are some non-human animals that might have more sentience than us. I don't think it's if we're going to say that there is a degree of sentience, I don't think it's a given that humans have the most capacity for
Yes.
sentience. So yeah, I think that's probably my take. Like I'm open to there being a degree of differing amounts of like capacity for sentience in different entities. I don't think we know, and like how much they have in different entities, and if we do have different amounts, then maybe we don't have the most, like we like to think we do sometimes. And artificial sentience could have an even greater capacity for sentience than us. Yeah, and I just want to point out that Rethink Priorities has done a little bit of work on this with their moral weightings project. So definitely check that out if you're interested in that topic, because they're trying to have like more rigorous look at to what degree would sentience differ in different beings, pigs versus humans versus everything else, etc. Because it's a hard question. Yeah,
definitely is, and I've from what I've read that the jury is still out in terms of this topic, in terms of like gradations, differences of sentience, as you said, between beings, and it is really interesting for the AI conversation for artificial sentience, because people often do use intelligence as almost like a proxy for sentience in a way. But then when it comes to AI, in terms of like, I don't know, mathematical ability, your average pocket calculator is significantly more intelligent in some sense of the word than your average human. And I think that it can. I think understanding there's a lot of work to be done to try and understand, the differences in sentience between beings, or abilities to experience pleasure and pain, or what this even means for different beings. Especially, as you said, because AI could far surpass, in theory, whatever we view as morally valuable. Potentially sentient AI could far surpass human beings if non-human animals haven't already got more of that thing that we value.
Yeah, definitely. Glad you mentioned that. If I could just add one thing there.
Sure.
Yes, I mean, AI is already more intelligent than us in a lot of ways, but most people who work on this, work on sentience and philosophy of mind, don't think that current AIs are sentient.
Yes.
So there seems to be like, it is something else that gives the sentience that's not just the simple version of intelligence, I guess.
Yes. And how did you first become aware of this topic of artificial sentience?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think probably science fiction is where I first sort of became aware of the concept or the possibility. A lot of older sci-fis talk about AI, depict AI, but I think only a little bit more recently has science fiction depicted AI as actually being sentient or having its own moral worth. So I guess a classic example is 2001: Space Odyssey. How very intelligent, but it doesn't seem to be a central theme that they're sentient and have moral worth. They just seem to be like a cold, like unfeeling machine that's just very intelligent. I mean, it may be the case they were sentient, but it's certainly not like talked about or just like portrayed in the show. So more recently, I think there have been a little bit more emphasis on on AI being intelligent but also sentient. The first place that I probably read this was Culture by Iain Banks. It's a science fiction series where artificial intelligence called minds, they're very prevalent in society, super intelligent, but also super sentient. So that's probably the first place that I became aware of the concept in general. But in terms of like a field of research, I think Brian Tomasic might have been the first place that I read about the possibility of AI being sentient. I think I was already aware of like artificial intelligence as a field of research before that, but Brian Tomasic I think was the first person I saw write about that. He's written about a lot of interesting things. He's also the person who, from his work, where I first found out about wild animal suffering as well. So his writing's been pretty influential for me, at least, for discovering new fields of things to be worried about.
Yeah, definitely for me too. Anything to do with reducing suffering, and we'll definitely link his essays below.
Mm.
It's interesting you mentioned how you first came across it in science fiction, and I think I did as well. I don't know if you've ever seen the Will Smith version of I, Robot, based on some
Yeah, yeah.
pretty famous science fiction books. But in it, there's a very sympathetic robot who has feelings, and we come to feel for by
Mm.
the end of the film. Yeah, I think I probably came across the subject through effective altruism, but most of the conversations that I could see were talking about existential risk that AI could wipe out humanity. And I love the Terminator films. Well, at least the first two. I say I loved, but 2 out of 7 or however many. So this very much appealed to me. But then I think it was Brian Tomasic who raised a perspective that we are missing something here. It's not just about how we might how the AI might pose a threat to us, but how the AI itself might suffer as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So we will definitely link the work of Brian Tomasic below. But why do you think? Because I think that some people, it's a bit of a reaction I've found, like not necessarily considered reaction, but it was like a knee-jerk reaction when I've talked about the suffering of artificial intelligence or just artificial sentience, where people kind of roll their eyes a little bit, even more so than say animal sentience. I think that people have had like, maybe they've had a pet or a positive interaction with a dog or something like that, and they can see that there's someone at home for non-human animals. But sometimes I've found, a slightly dismissive attitude towards artificial sentience. It's like, oh, we've got to care about these being as well. Now, do we? So why do you think the topic of artificial sentience is important as an area for like our moral concern?
Yeah, well, I think you raised a pretty good point there about we see animals all the time in the world, so it's
Yes.
easier to take that issue more seriously, I guess, and to imagine that they are or could be sentient. We probably don't have any artificial sentience in the world right now.
Yes.
So it's just harder, I think, for people to take it seriously. I guess we're at a different stage of the awareness of that problem. It's tricky with any issue that you want to be like super preventative about, that it's not even an issue yet and you want to stop it from ever happening. I think that's just a harder sell than like stopping an issue that is currently happening.
Yes.
But in general, why I think this is important. So I'm utilitarian. I think in general I want to reduce suffering, increase happiness in the world. So I think like generally that's links to why I'm an antinatalist as well. Like I generally don't think we should bring new humans or animals into the world for the same kind of reasons. And so similarly, artificial sentience, I don't think we should bring them into the world pretty much for the same reasons. But I guess like this, it's different because we're at that early stage where they're not here yet, but like we could be stopping a whole new entity of like type of minds, type of entities from coming into existence. So I get like the analogy I like is like imagine if you had the opportunity to like imagine like factory farming wasn't a thing yet, and like you're trying to stop that from happening.
Yes.
Like when there's no factory farms in the world. I mean, that would be pretty impactful if you manage to stop them from ever happening. It's still different even so to that, because animals already existed. This is like even more sort of unfathomable. Like it's just, I guess, just how important it is to like impactful to stop this from happening in the first place, to stop there from being artificial sentience in the first place. So I think antinatalists should be like especially worried about this. Even when we create artificial sentience, I think it would be pretty much impossible to get rid of it, or to like stop it from being a thing. I think it like once we create one thing that's one entity that's an AI that's sentient, it's probably here for good. Like I don't know. I mean, unless like there's suddenly a huge push to stop that. But like once it becomes common, I think it's game over. Basically, like they're just here to stay. Yeah, and I guess there's reasons to think like things might go particularly wrong with artificial sentience. So one is just the massive number of entities that there could be with artificial sentience. So because they're digital, they like you could have a huge amount per like unit area. I mean, I guess like so we're on one planet at the moment, and we're like constrained to space somewhat. There's only so many humans that can physically be on this planet, let alone like supported, unless one day we leave Earth or something. But AI, you can have so many more because they're just on a server, and you could have like, depending on how efficient they are computationally, you could have thousands, millions, billions on a server or in a server farm. And you could like very plausibly have trillions upon trillions of artificial sentient beings on Earth in servers at any given time. Some people talk about the possibility of being able to speed up like their perspective of time as well. So like in a second, maybe they've already had a whole life of suffering from their perspective. So yeah, I guess like it's an even bigger problem in scale than potentially than the suffering of biological beings. Like we'd probably, like, given our track record of how we treat others who are different to us, like we'd probably exploit them if we had the chance. We'd probably like exploit their labor. They'd probably be really efficient at mental labor. So yeah, I guess we'd probably like force them to work. We might like restart when they get tired and like upset, that we might just kind of wipe their memories and start them again, and all sorts of other unethical stuff. So yeah, I guess, and I get one more point on why it would be difficult to end it. Like with animal farming, it's hard. That's hard to get rid of, but we can sort of see a potential technological path to ending that. There's obviously the ethical path to ending that, but potentially we could end that through technology, like cellular agriculture, if that gets to the point where it's cheap enough, efficient enough, becomes accepted enough. If it's like same or better in taste and texture, like it's easy to see how that could end without the moral push. But I can't really think of anything like that for artificial sentience, because artificial sentience as like a mental workforce is kind of the ultimate. Yeah, like I don't know what you'd replace that with that would be better for, like, from a technological solution at least. So yeah, I think that's like, that emphasizes that probably once they're here, they're probably here to stay.
Definitely. And I think that was when you were talking about the lack of biological constraint on artificial sentience. And then when I can't remember who it was, but someone just gave the analogy of like copying and pasting, and how, you know, for a biological being to come into existence, there is obviously a gestation period, you know, usually some sort of mating or insemination, something like that, and then a gestation period, and then typically, at least in mammals, a small number of beings come into existence. But there is really no reason why with artificial sentience it would be any more difficult than, or plausibly it would be no more difficult than, say, copying and pasting, and just replicating. And as you said, that the space constraints are removed. We do fortunately as humans have some limits on the amount of, at least currently we do have some limits on the amount of suffering that we can endure. And it's not to say that artificial beings might not have a limit at some point, but I see no reason why it couldn't be significantly higher, as you're saying, like through the ability to experience time much faster, or whatever it might be, than biological beings. In the same way that, as we gave the example of a calculator, I think that digital circuits in terms of efficiency and speed are about 1 million times more, about 1 million times faster when it comes to computation. and basic maths. And a pocket calculator isn't seen as that impressive anymore. It's just something that we've kind of like taken for granted. And that's just processing information in terms of like maths equations. It really made me concerned that processing negative emotions, negative feelings, negative experiences could be significantly faster, significantly a much greater ability to do that than we have as biological beings. And there's one thing that I hadn't considered before, as you said, is that the tech solution. Just as you were talking there about the tech solution to animal agriculture, it made me think that often technology can, obviously, and in this case, technology can bring about, some quite negative moral change, but it can bring about more positive moral change as well. There are some arguments to say that certain forms of slavery or serfdom were made less appealing by the Industrial Revolution and certain kind of advances in agriculture. In the same way that we are hoping that, as you said, cellular agriculture might make animal farming less appealing or attractive or profitable. But as you said, what would replace artificial sentience in terms of like efficiency? It could well be the ultimate. And what would replace that?
Some people, I guess, I mean, it's like on the one hand, you might argue that you don't need something to be sentient for it to be very efficient at manual labor, but it could just be like an unfortunate byproduct. Like once something gets those capabilities to that degree, they just are sentient.
Yes.
So, I mean, maybe all else being equal, someone might choose like a non-sentient AI to do their work over a sentient AI, but it might not be all else being equal. And there might be reasons where someone might prefer a sentient AI for like entertainment purposes or something. Like maybe that's a selling point. Like, oh, the characters you interact with in this video game, like they really feel the pain when you stab them or something. Like, so I don't know. Some people might prefer that.
Might enjoy
not
that,
me, but
no, definitely. I don't know if you've seen the movie Her with Joaquin Phoenix.
No, but I think I know the concept. I think.
Yes, so he has a relationship with an artificial intelligence, like in his phone, he talks to him, and that's quite a positive interaction. But it's definitely a selling point there. People have pets and like the idea of looking after pets, and obviously this is in a positive sense, but pets still suffer and people suffer in relationships, etc. So there might be some reasons why people would in particular choose artificial sentience, and then, as we were saying before, the constraints for their ability to suffer might be significantly, a lot of the constraints on like the ability of biological beings to suffer might be removed. There's one thing you were saying there about sentience almost like as an emergent property of other things, where people might not necessarily intentionally choose a sentient being or intentionally even create a sentient being, but it might just kind of emerge once you create beings that have certain other kind of characteristics. I think that's a really important point in this whole conversation, is that from my understanding, and you would know a lot more than me on this, but we don't really know how sentience emerges in biological beings. So it's almost like we don't know how it emerges in us, or what kind of makes us sentient, and therefore we are potentially playing with fire a bit with we could potentially create sentience unintentionally within kind of digital beings.
Yeah, definitely. We don't really have a working theory of mind, which, as you just described, of like how we are sentient. I mean, the only person that we know is sentient is us, like just from being able to observe. But we assume that other humans are similar enough to us that they are also sentient. We assume that animals, because of their similarity to us, are sentient, and based on some observations. But we don't really. I mean, there are definitely like some theories, which some I'm not an expert at theory of mind, but some theorists of mind will say that some theories are better than others. Some theories are more plausible than others.
Yes.
Global workspace theory seems to be one of the big ones. But yeah, we don't know, and maybe like how would we know we've already created artificial sentience if we
Yes.
don't have a working theory of mind? We think we haven't created it yet, but we don't really know. And would we be able to tell if and when we did? I mean, probably not at this point. It might just be a point of like, well, it's similar enough to us now that we think it's sentient, but that's almost guessing.
Yes.
Like an informed guess, I suppose, but that is concerning because, yeah, I mean, people might say, well, we'll just stop like once they're sentient, we just won't make them any more sentient. We'll like scale it back a little bit, but like, how would we know?
Yes.
I think that's quite concerning.
Definitely, and I think someone pointed out that they're able to get like the text generation on a ChatGPT type AI to tell them that I'm alive, let me out, and this kind of thing. And someone said that might be the point in the AI in the sci-fi movie where the AI is like, it's thinking, it's feeling, it's alive.
Yeah. I mean, so Thomas Metzinger is a philosopher, and he's made this proposal to put a moratorium on the development of artificial sentience, like
Yes.
until either 2050 or until we develop like an actual working theory of mind that we're pretty confident about, and
Yes.
could be pretty sure that we're not going to create artificial sentience by accident. 2050 being, I guess, somewhat of an arbitrary pick. Maybe they'd prefer like more indefinitely if possible, but you've got to put a timeline of moratorium, so it might be less likely to get through. So, I mean, that's like a potential policy solution, maybe not solution, like band-aid for this problem. But yeah, like until we have a working theory of mind, I think that's the key thing. Like we just might not know.
Definitely. Interestingly, when we've been at Antinatalist Advocacy, when we've talked about non-human, like antinatalism or antinatalism before, to non-human beings, there does seem to be a difference, say, between animal agriculture and, say, like wild animal suffering, where in the one case we are bringing beings into existence, whereas for wild animal suffering we're not. It does seem that for artificial sentience, this does very much fall in the first camp of beings that we will be creating, at least initially, because in theory these beings will like replicate, like, and without any need of input from us. I think we've probably covered this, but why do you think and you mentioned this before, like, why do you think antinatalists in particular should be concerned about artificial sentience?
Yeah, I think just for the same reasons why an antinatalist might be concerned about humans. Yeah, I guess like insofar as you don't want humans to procreate because of the moral worth of the human that would be born. I suppose you don't want to create artificial sentient life, or sorry, not I should say artificial sentience. For the same reason. I mean, it's just a new entity that can suffer, and yeah, for the same reason. So, yeah, I don't know if I have anything neat to add, but apart from, as I said, it's like we're right on the cusp of kind of maybe a really important moment in history where we might have the opportunity to prevent it from happening or to not prevent it from happening. So I think, yeah, for that reason alone, like this should be on antinatalist radar. But also, I don't think like so. I disagree, but see maybe why some people are antinatalists for humans, but not for non-human animals. Maybe for wild animals or farmed animals. But artificial sentience might be different because maybe if someone is antinatalist for humans and not other animals because of the mental properties of the human, then that argument doesn't necessarily hold for artificial sentience because artificial sentience could be more like human minds than animals even. So one example that would be like very similar to a human mind is what's called a whole brain emulation. So the idea is that you would fully scan a human brain in such high detail and then be able to run that on some kind of like computer emulator. where it's pretty much indistinguishable from a real brain, just happens to be on a digital substrate instead of a biological substrate, but it acts like a human. It's like so real, so accurate and realistic that for all intents and purposes, we're pretty sure it's sentient, because it's running the same processes that a human brain is. Again, it just happens to be on a server. It's well that if that's sentient and that's like identical to a human in functionality, to a human mind, why would you? I don't see how you would care about the human brain but not the digital human brain.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely, and I think this is something, like why it would matter that it was on hardware rather than wetware. I think it's been termed in terms of like why the digital part of it would matter morally, because it was running digitally rather than a biological being.
I can't remember if you mentioned speciesism, but there's this idea now of substratism where maybe it shouldn't matter that they're on a different substrate, just like it shouldn't matter that they're a different species in terms of like a new ism, I guess.
No, definitely. And I think we are both, I mean, we're both consequentialists to some extent, but I don't think this concern is limited to people who are concerned about suffering or want to reduce suffering. I mean, whatever you think it is about human beings that makes them worthy of rights or just worthy of moral consideration, however you consider, like whatever kind of version of morality that you subscribe to, it should be hopefully clear from what we've been discussing that we see no reason why whatever trait that would be that makes someone worthy of moral consideration, and however you understand moral value and like right and wrong, the digitally sentient beings could have those traits, and potentially even to a greater extent than biological beings. What would you say are some of the arguments that you've heard? Some of the maybe more, rather than like the dismissal that we talked about earlier, or kind of like incredulity. What are some of the arguments you've heard against being concerned about artificial sentience, and why do you find them unconvincing?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think we talked about one already, which is the same argument from degree of difference to humans with animals, but then extending that to artificial sentience. But I think we've covered that one enough. The other one that I can think of that I'll add is maybe you just think like AI can't be sentient,
Yes.
or you think that AI might just hit some technological limit and like can't get to the point where it could be sentient. So I mean, I find it unlikely that we're anywhere near the physical limit, and I find it. I mean, just given the context of us not even having a solid theory of mind, or who won't know. Maybe we're 10% into the potential of AI. I think probably like much less than that is the reality. But let's say we are 10% into the potential of AI. We get closer to 100%. I mean, for all we know, the cutting point for where something is plausibly sentient is 20% or 50% of that. So I think it's hard to say that it definitely can't be sentient. And even I guess just the possibility of like whole brain emulations. Like if that's all that we can do, we can only get to whole brain emulations and no further in terms of sentient biological minds. Sorry, sentient digital minds. I mean, that's still a huge deal because you could, for the same reasons we spoke about before with servers and copying, and you can still have an enormous number, more whole brain emulations running at any given time than there are humans by many orders of magnitude.
Yes.
So even if that's all that we can do, that's still really concerning, and I don't think that is all we can do.
And on that note, obviously we've talked a lot about the kind of like the theory and what potentially might happen with digital sentience and how important. I think you said this could be a really important moment in history, because having created sentient AI, it doesn't look like an obvious way back. How can people have a positive impact on artificial sentience today? Or at least not,
Yeah.
not
So
on artificial sentience, on the problems that we have
mhm.
associated with artificial sentience.
Yeah, sure. Um, so obviously, making a contribution to a charity working on this problem. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
mostly charities. I think like specifically working on this problem, but there are some academics as well working on this or related problems. So like supporting those financially, I think would be good. Most of them are pretty funding constrained, if not all of them.
Yes.
But then also, I think there's a just because there's not that many people working on this problem, and part of that is because I mean, there's not much funding in it at the moment, but partly also because there's like a gap of talented people working on this problem as well. So in terms of like what ways, what I guess disciplines or careers could be useful for this problem, I guess obviously philosophy of mind and ethics, um, uh, like would be able to directly work on this problem. Um, Social science as well. Sentience Institute takes a pretty social science approach to the problem of understanding,
Yes.
like how what would the world be like with digital minds? What would their life be like, and how they interact with humans, and so on. I'm sure there's a lot of other science disciplines that would be like quite related. Computer science, I think, as well, if
Yes.
insofar as that might be helpful to answer the question of what it would take for an AI to be sentient. A lot of computer scientists, of course, are working like on directly trying to create AI, which, yeah, if you want to work on this problem, probably don't do that. But instead, like if if there's like a way to use the computer science to help understand what it would take to create sentient artificial sentience. Um,
Yes.
and then also like all the other stuff like advocacy and communications and marketing. I mean, we every movement needs those to encourage more people to take the issue seriously, to be involved. Uh, like policy and political careers, I think as
Mm.
well. Like if we were ever to um, like have a bill that directly targets this issue, I mean, those are the sorts of people who would be working on that problem. So that's important as well, I think. Um, but then on that, so I guess I think in general, I think the most important thing to do at the moment is to work out what to do, which isn't very
Yes.
satisfying. But we're at a pretty early stage, I guess, of this field, where I think we want to first work out what is probably best to do. But at the same time, we might have a very much of a ticking clock here. So it's a balance, I guess, between working out what to do, but then acting before it's too late. And I don't know what the right balance of that is. But in terms of like the more direct work, as in not the working out what to do, but the doing. Maybe, I mean, I know some people have talked about like potentially like a bill that bans. Oh, well, obviously Thomas Metzinger's moratorium in artificial sentience.
Yes.
Maybe a bill that just bans that, or like maybe slowing down AI progress and putting more regulations and restrictions on that. Um, yeah, but I think like any skill that's like generally involved in like um, uh, promoting an idea and making people take it more seriously, I think would be useful.
Definitely. And you mentioned the kind of social science approach of Sentience Institute. I found their work looking at attitudes towards digital sentience
Mm.
really interesting. So we'll definitely link all of that below. It is a really interesting one. It's an interesting problem where, as you said, there's pressure in both ways. There's this point of like, we still need to figure out what to do, but we
Mm.
really do need to act soon. Um,
Yeah,
it's a tough problem for sure.
yeah, yeah.
So yes, we'll try and link as many resources for people who are interested below. Any
Mm.
particular organisations? I mean, obviously you mentioned Sentience Institute quite a lot. Any particular organisations or individuals that we can support on this subject?
Yeah. So in terms of like non academics, like or research organizations specifically working on this, there's not that many. I think
Mm.
Sentience, as a percentage of their work, Sentience Institute is probably doing the most, like they're most focused on this. There are other organizations that do this and other things. So Some of them are Center for Reducing Suffering, Center on
Yes.
Long-Term Risk, Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, Legal Priorities Project. I may have missed a few, but also Future of Humanity Institute, which seems to have closed last month permanently.
Yes.
Not sure of the details fully on that, but they were doing some work on this. I guess they're closed now. In terms of academics, a couple that came to mind, because I think there are a decent number working either fully or partially on this, but some that came to mind were David Chalmers, Matty Wilkes, David Gunkel, Kirk Gray, Eric Schritzgebel, and Thomas Metzinger, who I mentioned before. But I'm sure there are many more that I've missed.
Great. And again, we'll be sure to link their work below. It's been great to have you on again, Michael. I think this has been a topic for me, certainly, that I've been nervously kind of concerned about, but not really knowing where to start. For all the reasons that we said around like being able to conceptualize what, understanding more about like what human suffering looks like or what non-human animal kind of suffering looks like, and then technically, I'm a bit of a technophobe at times, so I find this whole kind of field a little bit, a little bit mystifying. Something that I've been, as I said, nervous about, like from afar. So it's been really good to have you on to kind of demystify it to some extent, and also to point people towards, means of taking action for sure. Because as you said, there's a sense of urgency in that we are potentially on the threshold. I think someone described it as an alien invasion that is likely to happen. Not even necessarily an invasion. Let's say that super intelligent, super sentient aliens are going to come over from Mars, and we don't know if they will come. We don't know when they will come. We're not even sure what it will be like. We're not even sure we can tell when they do arrive, but theoretically, if and when they do come, it will be really, really important. So we need to prepare for it. And that's kind of how I feel about this topic. And yes, hopefully, maybe the David Pearces of this world are correct, and this is something that will never be developed because it will be technically impossible. But I definitely think that we should be prepared in case it isn't, for sure.
Definitely, I agree.
Great. Is there anything that you're working on or would like to signpost people to?
So I'm still thinking about what I'm going to do next with my career, but at the moment, I've been doing some science communication on YouTube and TikTok. I've been enjoying that at the moment, and hope to branch out to talking about more ethical issues as well at some point. So on YouTube, I'm a vegan space scientist, and on TikTok, I'm a space science guy.
Great. We'll be sure to link those below. Lawrence, Anton said he's been enjoying your science content. Although I'm trying to get him on TikTok. Like, I'm just saying, the algorithm on TikTok, I don't really understand it. Like, when I was doing some animal activism before, I made some very low effort, low quality videos, and some of them just picked up and went, got many views. So
it is a bit mystifying sometimes. I feel like the lower effort my video is, the better it does sometimes. Still working it out, but I'm having fun with it.
I've got a friend who put a solid maybe 3 months worth of research into a YouTube video that got like basically no views, and then they made a TikTok like on a whim that got like 400,000. So again, I'm a bit mystified in terms of how content gets out there, but in terms of raising awareness, which is something that we talked about before, obviously, of this subject, potentially TikTok might not be such a bad way to go for people who have that kind of like communication skill for sure. We'll definitely link people to your work. As we said at the end of our last episode together, episode 3, conversations in this space can, antinatalism and suffering and potential moral catastrophes like suffering, artificial sentience, they definitely can be a bit depressing from time to time, a bit negative. So we always like to end these podcasts with a positive note to end on. So is there anything related to this subject that's a bit more positive you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, I think some of the surveys of public attitudes to artificial sentience are encouraging. Um,
Yes.
so Sentience Institute has done a few rounds of their artificial intelligence morality and sentience survey. In 2023, 70% of US Americans support a ban on sentient AI.
Wow.
And overall, US Americans agreed that torturing robots and AI is wrong. So that's, I
Yes.
think, encouraging. And then another survey by Gabriel Lima found that, and their colleagues found that US Americans are supportive of protecting electronic agents from cruelty. Um, so I think that's encouraging. These are all US American examples, and most of these surveys you'll find are done on US Americans. So I would like to see more
Yes.
done on not on the rest of the world, because we might find something a little bit different. But hopefully that's a little bit of a positive note to end on. That I think people are starting to take this a little bit more seriously. I think ChatGPT and large language models in general played a pretty big role in that. There's a lot more excitement and attention around AI in the last few
Mm.
years. But to some extent, I guess an upside of that is people take a little bit more seriously the possibility that they can be sentient. So again, in the AIMS Sentience Institute's AIMS survey, 20% of US Americans already think that AI is sentient already, and 10%
Yes.
thought that ChatGPT was sentient. Um, so, uh, I mean, and people are already taking this more seriously because of ChatGPT. So that's been interesting, and be curious to see what the next AI news cycle is. Maybe with the next big GPT model or something. It's like
Yes.
even more convincing.
Definitely. And I was just wondering when you're saying about the survey data being quite promising, and I definitely agree those are quite promising results. One of the things that when it comes to animal agriculture, if you look at the survey data of people, like a huge proportion of people support an outright ban on factory farming.
Yeah.
And a really surprising number, I think in America, it's over 40% support an outright ban on slaughterhouses.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 1 in 20 Americans that don't eat animals, like some sort of vegetarian or vegan.
Yeah.
Yet, 4 out of 10 would support a ban on slaughterhouses. Now, obviously, if you change the question to say, and therefore you won't be able to eat meat, that number does drop, but it is still considerably
Yeah.
higher than the proportion of vegans or vegetarians. Now, understandably, some people dismiss those figures and say, oh, well, they're just clicking out on a survey and they won't be willing to change their lives.
Mm.
One thing I was thinking about digital sentience is that maybe because people aren't used to it, they're not used to life
Mm-hmm.
with digital sentience, that they might be a bit more supportive of taking preventative measures to stop it from coming into existence. I think one of the great
Mm.
problems with animal agriculture isn't so much that people dislike animals or don't care about animals. It's more that they're used to their way of life and they don't want to change. So maybe that's something that we can be optimistic about, is that um, people are quite happy without digital sentience and find the topic quite scary. So therefore might be supportive of measures to, prevent uh, digital sentience and sentience digital beings that can suffer from having to experience that. Maybe be a bit more
Yeah.
kind of bold up
I
front,
like.
if you like.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I hadn't thought about that. I haven't thought about it that way before, but that's interesting. And then, yeah, I guess that goes back to like it's going to be easy to prevent it from happening in the first place than it is to get rid of it once artificial sentience is here.
Yes,
Um,
definitely.
yeah, cool.
But yeah, thank you again. Thanks so much for coming on again, Michael. And thank you to you, the listener, for tuning in. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Antinatalist Advocacy Podcast. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. We'd also be really grateful if you could help us get the word out there by sharing this episode far and wide, as well as giving us a positive rating on whichever platform you're listening to us on. To find out more about AA, including careers advice, donation recommendations, and different ways to have a positive impact, you can go to our website at antinatalisadvocacy.org. To keep up to date with what we're up to, feel free to subscribe to our monthly newsletter and follow us on your favourite social media platforms. Links to all of the above are in the description. As always, we are hoping you will join us in our antinatalist advocacy.